There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has no name. It is not the tiredness that comes from running or working or even grieving. It is the tiredness of performing, of waking up every single morning and assembling a version of yourself that is palatable, impressive, digestible to the world. We know this exhaustion intimately, even if we have never spoken it aloud. We curate photographs of our lives with the precision of museum archivists. We caption our pain with witty observations so that even our suffering looks elegant. We build entire architectures of identity on platforms designed to collapse, and then we wonder why we feel hollow standing in the rubble. Somewhere between the filtered image and the raw face behind the screen, a real human being is quietly suffocating, and the tragedy is not that we are falling apart. The tragedy is that we are falling apart while smiling, while succeeding, while everyone around us applauds. In 1953, a young woman named Esther Greenwood arrives in New York City to begin a prestigious magazine internship. She is brilliant. She is talented. She has won every scholarship, impressed every professor, and earned her place among the most promising young women of her generation. And she feels absolutely nothing. She is surrounded by glamour, by cocktail parties and fashion editors, and the dazzling machinery of a world that tells her she should be thrilled. And yet she describes herself as sitting in the middle of it all, numb, like a still point in a hurricane of expectation. This is the opening wound of Sylvia Plath's devastating novel, The Bell Jar, and what makes it so unbearable, so impossibly relevant nearly 70 years after its publication, is that Esther's emptiness is not born from failure, it is born from success. She has done everything right. She has followed every instruction, climbed every ladder, and the reward waiting for her at the top is a view of her own disappearance. This novel is not fiction in the way we usually understand that word. The Bell Jar is one of the most harrowing semi-autobiographical works in the history of literature. Sylvia Plath poured her own marrow into these pages. Like Esther, Plath was a dazzling scholarship student who won a guest editorship at a major magazine in New York. Like Esther, she returned home to a world that could not contain her. Like Esther, she descended into a psychological crisis so severe that the medical establishment of the time treated her with methods that were as much punishment as they were cure. And unlike Esther, whose story Plath gave the ambiguous mercy of a final chapter, Plath herself did not survive the weight of her own bell jar. She died in 1963, at the age of 30, only weeks after the novel was published under a pseudonym. She was a mother of two small children, one of the most gifted poets the English language has ever produced, and a woman whose mind burned with a clarity that the world around her could neither match nor tolerate. Her death was not a romantic act. It was not a poetic gesture. It was the catastrophic, irreversible loss of a human being who had been brilliant enough to see the world's contradictions and too honest to pretend she did not. When we read The Bell Jar, we are not reading a story. We are reading a warning written in the author's own blood, and we owe it to her memory to hear what she was actually saying. What Plath was saying, through Esther's fracturing consciousness, is something we are still desperately afraid to confront. She was saying that the structures we build to define a successful life, the expectations we internalize as natural and inevitable, are not neutral. They are violent. They do not simply guide us, they consume us. And nowhere is this violence more exquisitely rendered than in the novel's most famous passage, the metaphor of the fig tree. Esther imagines herself sitting beneath a great fig tree, and from every branch hangs a different future. One fig is a brilliant academic career. Another is a loving husband and children. Another is travel, adventure, freedom. Another is fame as a poet. Each fig is ripe, gorgeous, bursting with possibility. And Esther sits beneath the tree, starving, because she cannot choose. She wants every fig simultaneously, and the very act of reaching for one means watching all the others wither and drop to the ground. So she sits, she watches, and one by one, every fig blackens and rots at her feet. This is not simply a metaphor about indecision. This is a metaphor about the architecture of impossibility that society constructs around ambitious human beings, and in the 1950s, around women in particular. The cruelty is not that the choices exist. The cruelty is the silent, vicious insistence that there is one correct combination, one perfect sequence, and if we fail to find it, we deserve the hunger. We live inside this same fig tree today. We have simply given it new names. We call it optimization. We call it life design. We call it having it all. We scroll through the curated lives of strangers who appear to have plucked every fig from every branch and arranged them in a photogenic bowl, and we conclude that our inability to do the same is a personal deficiency rather than a structural lie. The fig tree is not a test of character. It is a trap. And Esther's paralysis beneath it is not weakness. It is the only rational response to an irrational demand. Then there is Buddy Willard, the young man who represents everything Esther is supposed to want. Buddy is handsome, promising, studying to be a doctor. He is the kind of man mothers dream about and society rewards. And he is, in every way that matters, a fraud. Not because he is intentionally malicious, but because he has been shaped by a system that confuses conformity with virtue. Buddy preaches purity to Esther while secretly having an affair. He tells her that once she becomes a mother, she will no longer want to write poems, as if the creative fire burning inside her is merely a placeholder for domesticity, a temporary fever that will break the moment she fulfills her biological function. Buddy is not the villain of this story. He is the embodiment of the society that is the villain. He is the smiling face of a world that measures a woman's value by her willingness to shrink. And the terrifying thing about Buddy is not his hypocrisy. It is how many of us have loved our own version of him. How many of us have stood before someone who told us, gently and with apparent kindness, that our ambitions were cute, our complexity was a phase, and our hunger for meaning was something we would outgrow once we settled into the shape the world had already cut for us. And this brings us to the bell jar itself, the metaphor that gives the novel its name and its suffocating power. Esther describes her condition as being trapped under a bell jar, a glass dome like those used in laboratories to create a vacuum. She is visible to the world, people can see her, they can tap on the glass and smile, but she is breathing her own recycled air, growing sicker on the fumes of her own isolation, and no matter where she goes, the bell jar travels with her. Plath writes, and this is among the most chilling passages in all of modern literature, that wherever she sat, on the deck of a ship or at a sidewalk cafe in Paris or Bangkok, she would be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in her own sour air. The sour air. That phrase should haunt every one of us, because the sour air is not a symptom of clinical depression alone. The sour air is the accumulation of every performance, every suppressed truth, every time we swallowed our real response and offered the acceptable one instead. The sour air is the atmosphere of inauthenticity, and we are all breathing it, some of us just more consciously than others. What Plath understood, with a prescience that borders on the prophetic, is that the bell jar is not placed over us from outside. We build it from within. We internalize the gaze of parents, lovers, institutions, algorithms, and we construct an invisible enclosure that follows us everywhere, filtering every experience through the question of how it looks rather than how it feels. The bell jar is the Instagram grid we arrange while crying. It is the performance review we ace while medicating ourselves to function. It is the dinner party where we laugh on cue while something inside us is screaming. And the most devastating feature of the bell jar is not that it traps us, it is that it is transparent. We can see the world, we can see freedom. We can watch other people appear to live without this glass between themselves and reality, and we assume the problem is us. We assume that everyone else is breathing real air, and we alone are suffocating in our own recycled grief. But Plath is telling us something far more radical than that. She is telling us that the bell jar is the culture itself. The entire society is enclosed. Some of us simply notice it sooner than others, and those who notice it are called sick. This is the philosophical dynamite at the heart of this novel. Esther's breakdown is not a personal medical failure. It is a form of distorted, devastating clarity. She sees what others refuse to see. She sees that Buddy Willard's world, the world of tidy expectations and gendered hierarchies and sterile suburban destinies, is not sane. It is organized madness. It is a system that demands women be simultaneously brilliant and compliant, ambitious and unthreatening, sexual and pure, creative and domestic. And when a woman cannot hold all of these contradictions at once without cracking, the system calls her crazy and sends her for treatment. The treatment, in Esther's case and in Plath's, was electroconvulsive therapy administered without proper care, a brutal intervention that the novel describes with the visceral horror of someone who has felt electricity rewrite the architecture of her mind. Esther is not broken by her illness. She is broken by a world that insists she should be grateful for her cage. And here is where we must turn the mirror toward ourselves, gently, without cruelty, but with absolute honesty. We live in an era that has multiplied the branches of Esther's fig tree into infinity. We no longer face a handful of possible lives. We face millions, streaming past us on screens every waking hour, each one presented as achievable, each one implying that our current existence is insufficient. We have democratized the bell jar. We have made it available to everyone, regardless of gender, class, or geography. The pressure to perform a perfect life is no longer confined to 1950s white suburban femininity. It has metastasized into a universal condition. We sacrifice our authenticity for a decorated despair, and we do it so skillfully that even our therapists sometimes cannot tell the difference between our performance and our pain. The modern bell jar is built of metrics: followers, likes, engagement rates, productivity scores, credit ratings, body measurements, steps counted, calories burned, hours optimized. We have turned the act of being alive into a dashboard, and we monitor ourselves with the same clinical detachment that the doctors in Plath's novel used to monitor Esther. We have become our own asylums, our own electrodes, our own sterile wards, and the sour air thickens. It thickens every time we compare our interior chaos to someone else's exterior composure. It thickens every time we describe ourselves as fine when we are anything but. It thickens every time we reach for a fig and feel the others rotting in our peripheral vision. But Plath, even in the depths of the novel's darkness, offers something that is easy to miss if we are not paying careful attention. She offers the possibility, however fragile, of the bell jar lifting. Near the end of the novel, Esther describes the bell jar rising, like the weight of a terrible dream dissolving in the morning light, and she acknowledges in the same breath that it could descend again at any moment. This is not a triumphant cure. It is not a Hollywood recovery montage. It is something far more honest and far more useful. It is the admission that freedom from the bell jar is not a permanent state. It is a practice. It is a daily, sometimes hourly, decision to breathe real air instead of recycled performance. It is the willingness to sit beneath the fig tree and choose one fig, any fig, not because it is the perfect choice, but because choosing imperfectly is the only alternative to starving perfectly. What Sylvia Plath teaches us, at a cost that we can never fully comprehend, is that the pursuit of perfection is not a path to excellence. It is a path to annihilation. The bell jar does not descend over people who are failing. It descends over people who are succeeding so thoroughly at being what the world wants that they have lost all contact with what they actually are. The mask becomes the face, the performance becomes the identity, and one day we wake up in the middle of our own glittering achievement and realize that we have no idea who is living this life, because the person who began it disappeared somewhere along the way, suffocated quietly beneath the glass while everyone watched and applauded. Breaking the bell jar does not require genius. It does not require dramatic reinvention. It requires something much harder. It requires the willingness to be seen as imperfect, incomplete, and in progress. It requires the courage to reach for one fig and let the others fall without calling it failure. It requires the radical, almost unbearable honesty of saying, I am not fine, and I am not performing anymore. And the air out here is cold and strange, but it is real and it is mine. Sylvia Plath gave us this book as a lantern for the darkest corridor of human experience. She wrote it knowing that the world would try to reduce it to a case study, a cautionary tale, a footnote in literary history. But it is none of those things. It is a mirror. And if we are brave enough to look into it without flinching, we will see not just Esther Greenwood, not just Sylvia Plath, but ourselves, sitting under the fig tree, breathing our own sour air, wondering why the applause sounds so far away, and perhaps, just perhaps, beginning to crack the glass. The air outside is not perfect, it never was, but it is real, and real is enough.